Okay, hi everyone, and thank you very much for coming to the presentation today. My name is Mark James, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department at Arizona State University. In today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about these two phenomena, cross-linguistic influence, or CLI, and transfer of learning. By the way, there is a handout. I will also be posting my slides and a recording of my presentation on my website, my ASU website. So anyone who's interested can find me through the English department at the ASU website, and you can download this if you'd like to have the slides and the recording. I come at this topic from the perspective of a researcher who has been studying learning transfer in second language education. Over the past few years, I have been studying whether the learning that occurs in ESL classrooms transfers beyond the walls of those classrooms. My perspective on learning transfer comes from education and educational psychology. But through my research, I've learned that there is a second language acquisition construct, CLI, that appears to be similar to learning transfer. So I've explored the relationship between the two constructs and found that while each has been and continues to be the subject of extensive research and theory, there are relatively few explicit, constructive links to scholarly work on learning transfer in literature dealing with CLI. Today we'll take a closer look at this gap, which I think is a worthwhile task, because if there is in fact a substantial relationship between these two constructs, research and theory on CLI might benefit from stronger connections to research and theory on learning transfer. So I'll speak about this for 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. So to begin with, what are we talking about when we use the terms CLI and learning transfer? First, CLI, which is commonly called language transfer, is typically defined as the influence that knowledge of one language has on an individual's learning or use of another language. For example, if I, as a native speaker of English, try to learn Spanish, my pronunciation of Spanish words might sound like my pronunciation of English words. Or I might combine Spanish words using English word order. In these cases, CLI is occurring because my knowledge of English is influencing my learning or use of Spanish. CLI has been one of the central topics of research interest in literature related to second language learning. So there's a huge body of research on this topic. And this research has examined CLI in terms of lexy, morphology, syntax, phonology, reading and writing skills, and even gestures and attitudes toward language use. Learning transfer, on the other hand, is the influence that prior learning has on subsequent learning or performance. For example, learning transfer is what occurs when children apply lessons learned from school when they are out in the, quote, real world. For example, kids might apply lessons learned from a math class to deal with money when they go shopping. Learning transfer has been of central interest in psychology, education, and human resources development, and the body of research and theory on this topic is massive and stretches back over a century. Now, here's a point that is central to the argument that I'm making today. As these definitions show, CLI and learning transfer both refer to the application of knowledge and skills in novel situations. With CLI, the knowledge and skills are language related, and the novel situation is an individual's learning or use of a different language. With learning transfer, the knowledge, skills, and novel situation can be related to a variety of domains besides language. So the key point here is that, conceptually speaking, CLI appears to be one specific kind of learning transfer. Now, if CLI is a kind of learning transfer, it would make sense to see connections to learning transfer research and theory in literature dealing with CLI. But such connections are uncommon. That doesn't mean that there are no connections. Here's a list of connections that I have found, including statements that CLI research evolved from research on learning transfer, and references to learning transfer theory in discussions about how language teachers might address CLI, and statements that some aspects of learning transfer theory might be relevant to CLI. But these connections tend to be relatively superficial or outdated. And besides these connections listed here, mention of learning transfer in literature dealing with CLI appears to be rare. Because of the conceptual relationship between CLI and learning transfer, this scarcity of connections seems puzzling. So I took a closer look at the research literature on CLI and the research literature on learning transfer to see if I could understand more about the relationship and perhaps figure out why the connections were uncommon. What I found first was that the conceptual relationship between CLI and learning transfer actually goes deeper, because some of the factors that impact CLI also impact learning transfer. Here's the list of factors I'm talking about, and I'll describe each one briefly. One factor prominent in explanations of CLI is individuals' perceptions of cross-linguistic similarity. Researchers point out that CLI is more likely when an individual perceives some kind of similarity between a first and second language. And this is usually the case regardless of any objective similarity between the languages. Interestingly, perceptions of similarity are also important to learning transfer, because research shows that learning transfer is more likely to occur when an individual perceives some kind of similarity between two situations. A second factor that's believed to impact CLI is proficiency. Researchers have pointed out that the greater an individual's proficiency in one language, the more likely it is that that language will influence the learning or use of another language. A parallel point has been made about learning transfer, where researchers have suggested that the greater the size and depth of an individual's knowledge base, the more able that individual is to make connections that lead to learning transfer. Knowledge base and language proficiency are parallel in the sense that both have to do with an individual's cumulative knowledge and skills. A third factor that has been identified as impacting CLI is motivation. Although this factor has received relatively little attention, researchers have pointed out that motivation is one of the non-linguistic factors that can impact CLI. As for learning transfer, motivation has been identified as important here too. For example, researchers have highlighted motivation as part of an individual's disposition toward learning transfer. And they've suggested that without a positive disposition, learning transfer is less likely to occur. A fourth factor that influences CLI is interlocutor characteristics. Researchers have pointed out that individuals' use of a second language can vary depending on characteristics of an interlocutor. For example, an individual's pronunciation of a second language may be more target-like when speaking with native speakers of that second language, and less target-like when speaking with other non-native speakers of that second language. As for how this relates to learning transfer, interlocutor characteristics can be seen as part of a sociocultural context. And sociocultural context is another factor that is believed to impact learning transfer. Research suggests that learning transfer is more likely when an individual believes that the sociocultural context supports transfer. For example, when other people around them, like friends or coworkers or supervisors, actually value such transfer. The final factor listed here as impacting CLI is automaticity. Researchers explain that CLI can be seen as the activation of skills that are highly automatized and that are used without any conscious control. For language skills to develop to that point requires extensive practice. This is the overlap with learning transfer, where amount and type of practice is seen as an important factor. Researchers here have pointed out that one of the main reasons learning transfer may fail is due to insufficient practice using the knowledge or skills in question. This list of overlapping factors does not mean that there are no important differences between these two constructs. Explanations of CLI include factors specific to the domain of language use, and these don't easily equate with factors in other domains. For example, some CLI research has studied the impact of linguistic context by looking at how the letters, words, or sounds before and after a particular language feature impact CLI with that feature. Despite any differences, though, the points of overlap discussed here are significant and support the idea that CLI is a kind of learning transfer. Besides uncovering some of the depth of the relationship between CLI and learning transfer, I also found that there had been some explicit avoidance of connections to learning transfer in CLI literature. Learning transfer has roots in behavioral psychology, which is a school of thought on human behavior that became widely discredited in the mid-20th century. This association with behavioral psychology was seen as problematic by some researchers studying CLI, and this quote illustrates some of the reasons why. For example, the laboratory research designs that were typical of experimental behavioral psychology were seen as too rigid and precise, and as involving learning that was too superficial to be relevant to complex language behavior. But in looking closely at the literature on CLI and the literature on learning transfer, we can see at least 3 good reasons why these arguments for viewing learning transfer as different from CLI are less compelling now than they may have been in the past. The first reason has to do with the idea that learning transfer research is associated with behavioral psychology. The fact is that although a behavioral psychology perspective was common in early work on learning transfer, this isn't the only perspective that has been taken. Learning transfer has also been examined from Gestalt, cognitive, and sociocultural psychology perspectives. For example, a Gestalt perspective has been used to explain learning transfer that occurs in the absence of obvious similarities between situations. This is very different from the stimulus-response situations that behavioral psychologists were interested in. Learning transfer is explained from a Gestalt perspective as having to do with an individual's understanding of abstract general principles, which the individual is then able to apply in various situations. Also, a cognitive perspective has been used to examine learning transfer in terms of the inner workings of the human mind, which contrasts sharply with the behavioral psychology focus on external observable behavior. From a cognitive perspective, learning transfer has to do with internal mental processes, like how knowledge is represented in the mind. Much of the research on learning transfer in the last 30 years has taken a cognitive perspective. And finally, a sociocultural perspective has been used to expand the scope of research on learning transfer. Rather than studying learning transfer in only narrow, decontextualized tasks, researchers from this perspective have examined learning transfer in more complex, real-world contexts. For example, much of the research on learning transfer in human resources development settings has taken a sociocultural perspective, focusing on the way that support from coworkers and supervisors can influence learning transfer from workplace training. So, work on learning transfer has not been limited to a behavioral psychology perspective. The second reason has to do with the idea that the learning focused on in learning transfer research is not relevant to complex language behavior. It is true that some research on learning transfer has examined learning outcomes that do not seem relevant to language use. For example, physical skills like typing or memorization of lists of numbers. But learning transfer research has also examined learning outcomes that do seem more relevant to language use. Here's a list of language-related learning outcomes that have been the focus of recent research on learning transfer. This includes knowledge of vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, listening perception, phonological awareness, reading skills and strategies, and writing skills and strategies. For example, in one of the studies at the bottom of the list, by AAAL, The researchers created a 7th grade reading and writing curriculum that taught students strategies such as how to categorize ideas in a text as general or specific, and how to write a paragraph. The study then examined whether learning outcomes from the new curriculum transferred to compositions written in different subjects in the 7th and 8th grades. The learning outcomes listed here parallel to at least some degree learning outcomes focused on in studies of CLI. The third reason has to do with the idea that in learning transfer research, the learning involved is superficial compared to the deep learning of a first language associated with CLI research. A problem with this idea, though, is that research on CLI itself has evolved and is not restricted to studying only deeply learned aspects of a first language. Although CLI is often viewed as the influence of a first language on second language learning and use, current definitions of CLI tend to be broader and also include the influence of a second language on the learning and use of a third language or a fourth language and so on, as well as the influence of a second language on first language use. This is important because there's tremendous variety in the depth of learning associated with a second language. So if the source of CLI is a second language, the learning involved may not necessarily be deep. So those are 3 reasons why arguments for a divergence of scholarly work on CLI from scholarly work on learning transfer are less convincing now than they may have been in the past. With this in mind, research and theory on learning transfer might be considered as a source of information and ideas for research and theory on CLI. And I'll spend the last 3.5, 4 minutes of the presentation discussing several ways that might happen. One way constructive connections might be made is by looking to learning transfer theory for help in answering questions already raised about CLI. For example, a persistent question about CLI has to do with how individuals identify cross-linguistic similarities. Possible answers might be found in learning transfer theory that has offered neurological explanations for how individuals identify similarities. For example, the idea has been put forth that the human brain is hardwired with a kind of harmonic structure that allows it to recognize similar relationships in situations where there are no concrete overlapping elements. That's how we are able to recognize a song when it's played in a key higher or lower than what we've heard before. The new notes we hear don't overlap with the notes that we heard before, but our brain recognizes that the relationships between notes in the new version of the song and in the old version of the song are the same. Another way constructive connections might be made is by looking to learning transfer research for new questions worth exploring about CLI. One source of new questions is learning transfer studies that examine language-related outcomes. For example, in one study that focused on reading skills, researchers found that training students to analyze compare-contrast expository texts had a positive influence when they later analyzed other texts that had a similar structure. But this influence did not extend to texts that had a different structure, like a pro-con expository structure. So this raises an interesting question that might be asked about CLI. If the transfer of reading strategies across first language situations is constrained by similarity in genre, would the transfer of those same reading strategies to second language situations also be constrained by similarity in genre? New questions might also come by looking at some of the topics that have been of interest to learning transfer researchers and seeing if these might be looked at more closely in CLI research. For example, both motivation and sociocultural context have been highlighted as very important factors in research on learning transfer, but have received less attention in research on CLI. Research might therefore be carried out to see if, for example, CLI is more likely if an individual feels motivated to make use of existing first language knowledge and skills in second language use situations. Or if CLI is more likely when an individual feels like she or he is being encouraged to make use of existing first language knowledge and skills. That encouragement coming from the sociocultural context. These are just some of the questions that might emerge from a careful look at learning transfer research and theory, and that might help shed more light on CLI. So to summarize, the purpose of this presentation was to examine the relationship between CLI and learning transfer. two constructs that appear to be similar. This is worthwhile because each construct is the subject of extensive research and theory, yet there appear to be relatively few explicit, constructive links to scholarly work on learning transfer in literature dealing with CLI. A central point made here was that the relationship between these constructs is more than superficial. CLI can be seen as a kind of learning transfer. Besides making sense conceptually, this point is supported by overlap in theories of CLI and learning transfer. I also suggested that due to research developments related to each construct, arguments made in the past for a divergence of research on CLI from research on learning transfer are less convincing now. As a result, fruitful connections to learning transfer research and theory can be made in scholarly work on CLI. And that's it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or have a discussion. Thank you. And the last few slides here, I have a list of references, which you guys also have on your handout. And again, if you download this from my site, you'll get these slides. Please.
Well, I have a personal experience already. My students make a cross-linguistic influence from the L2 to the L3. And they transfer syntactical structure from the L2 to the L3. Is it due to a cross-linguistic influence, or is it due to a lack of competence in the L3?
I don't know if those are mutually exclusive. So this
maybe both. What do you think?
Yeah, because if we are trying to identify what's happening, that could be, like you say, that could be a case of cross-linguistic influence, L2 influencing L3. That's answering the question, what's happening. If we're asking why it's happening, because of proficiency, levels of proficiency, yeah, that's looking at the question of why it's happening. So I think those two things can happen together. CLI because of proficiency. Yeah.
Do you think this is a natural tendency, propensity from our students to have this cross-linguistic influence? Do you think it always happens?
I mean, it happens a lot, right? Because there's a lot of research on the topic going back. Some of the early widely cited studies on this topic are from the 1950s. And since then, there's been a heap of research on cross-linguistic influence, which suggests to me that it happens a lot, that researchers think that it's important. There have been waves in the way that it's been given attention. So early on in the research, it was seen as a very important factor. In the 1970s and 80s, I think researchers started looking at other factors, other phenomena in first language, second language use, and it wasn't given as much, or it wasn't seen as such an important factor, but researchers are still very interested in how it happens, right? It's just that other factors started getting more, or perhaps equal attention. And there's I looked at some research just in the last 10 years, and CLI research to see what's happening in this area, and there's a lot of research on this topic. So that all suggests to me that it's a very common phenomenon. Yeah. Now, but as to why it's happening, which is a different question, right?
Yes.
Why is it happening? And you're talking about proficiency. This is one of the factors that researchers have identified as being important to CLI and to learning transfer, the topic that I've been focusing on. But there are other factors as well, not just proficiency, but things like cross-linguistic similarity. That's the factor that's probably received the most attention. Is CLI occurs when the human mind recognizes on some level similarity between two languages. And interestingly, it doesn't have to be an objective similarity. It could be something that the individual thinks is similar. So anyway, that's the factor that's received the most attention, seems to be. So yeah, but proficiency is certainly one that researchers have been interested in and focusing on as well. Shall we go to another question? Yeah. Okay, please.
You mentioned that there have been literature looking at logical awareness in terms of transfer. I was wondering if there's any other research that's been done looking more at these underlying cognitive skills.
Looking at more of these underlying.
Like underlying cognitive skills, so like phonological awareness or syntactic or whatever.
So some of the research on CLI that we could categorize or classify as CLI research has been looking at higher order skills and knowledge. There was a couple of interesting papers. And what's the person's name now? Oh boy, I'm forgetting the person's name now. But a couple of studies, one of which was in applied linguistics in the last couple of years. I think it was in 2007, where a researcher designing a CLI study was interested in these higher order thinking skills. I think that particular study, they were looking at the way that the human mind sort of is able to group concepts, and so looking not just at language, the surface features of language that transfer, but these higher order thinking skills. Another really interesting study. Who did that one? Oh, I've got that one on here. Jarvis, the one at the top, Jarvis and Pavlenko. It's not just a study. This is a book about one of the most recent sources that I've found, 2008, a book about CLI, and they've got an interesting perspective on it. They spend the first few chapters summarizing the history of CLI research, but then they propose that again, things need to be expanded, and we need to look not just at language, surface features of language and structures, but higher order thinking. And I can't remember exactly what higher order thinking they were looking at, but it was an interesting book, an interesting perspective on that. So yeah, CLI researchers are looking at this kind of thing. For those of you who might be familiar with Jim Cummins' work, bilingual education, Jim Cummins has talked about how language proficiency from one language influences another, CLI, but also talks about an underlying sort of higher level of thinking that can transfer from one language to another. So yeah, that kind of stuff is out there, definitely. Yeah. I think, just to follow up, that's a point I would make. I'm trying to look at, or I wanted to see what the relationship is between these two constructs, because, like I said at the beginning, my work, I look at learning transfer from an educational psychology perspective, and I was interested in what's happening with this in second language acquisition literature with this other construct that's got the same name, right? Transfer, language transfer. While I found these interesting sort of gaps that I'm hoping this kind of work might help to bridge, that doesn't mean that there's a huge gap. It doesn't mean that there's no attention paid to, for example, higher order thinking skills from the CLI perspective. There are some connections that have been made, but I was just kind of surprised to see that the connections were not as much as I would have thought, knowing how much research has been done and how much interesting theory there is on learning transfer. If these two things are connected, then it seems to me that we might there might be more cross-fertilization. Maybe one more question?
2 more minutes.
So, do you think that the more language a student speaks, the more strategies that they can apply in learning? No matter learning what, maybe math or others, that cross-linguistic.
That's interesting. I mean, I would just be guessing. I haven't done any empirical research on that myself. What kind of strategies are you thinking of? Like, what kind of strategies are you thinking that might be developed from learning multiple languages?
The reason why I ask this question is because in the field of trilingualism or multilingualism, according to many scholars such as Cook, they claim that the more language you speak, then the more skill that you can use when you learn a new language. So just follow that.
Right. You know what? That makes sense. Now I'm thinking again from the perspective of learning transfer. Okay, and in learning transfer research and theory, one practical application of that theory is that educational psychologists and researchers talk about teaching for transfer techniques, right? How can we as teachers teach in a way that will stimulate learning transfer beyond the walls of our classroom? And one of the things that they talk about, one of the techniques they talk about doing with students, and this applies not to language, this applies to math, science, whatever, is that you have students work with multiple examples of whatever the thing is that they're learning. So the idea that, by looking not just at one way of doing a math problem, but they look at multiple examples, the purpose there is that they will hopefully abstract their knowledge, which then becomes more transferable. That's the idea, right? By looking at multiple examples, things become more transferable. So that might apply in this case as well. If you've learned several languages, perhaps your brain has noticed things, underlying structures of language that you're able then to transfer more easily. It would fit with learning transfer research in theory. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much.